The years were 91 to 98 when I was here, and those years are still very special to me in so many ways. A number of people are still here that were here then, but a lot of new people are here too, and that's a wonderful thing. You sing well. Jack, you did a good job, and I appreciate the leading of those songs tonight and us being able to sing along together. I want to talk to you tonight about Esther. It may be that one of the reasons people have not preached as much about Esther is because you can't preach on it without telling the story. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to just take the time to go through the story. Got a lot of slides here. This all comes from the Read and Grow Picture Bible that I used when my little girl was growing up. And by the way, there's an excellent website called Free Bible Images. And I mean, they just have tons of Bible images that you could use if you teach classes, and so that's where a lot of these pictures come from tonight. I want to tell you the story of Esther tonight. I remember that thing, if you hit it too hard, it wants to zoom on, doesn't it? In the days of Persian domination, King Xerxes, who was also known as Ahasuerus, was the most powerful man in the world. In the 3rd year of his reign, he invited the nobles and the princes to a feast which lasted 180 days. Can you imagine a 180-day feast? Living in his empire were many, many Jews, as you're going to see tonight. And after the long feast, the king invited everyone at his palace in Susa or Shushan to another feast that lasted 7 days. And so this guy, he loved to feast, didn't he? Everyone drank from cups of gold, and Queen Vashti, who was the queen to begin with in this story, gave a party for the women in another part of the palace. At the end of the 7 days, the king, who by this time was well drunk, ordered his 7 servants to fetch Queen Vashti so that he could show off her beauty. But they reported back to him that the queen refused to join him. Perhaps that was because of some modesty reasons. The king was furious, and his wise men advised him, saying, "The queen has not only insulted you, but she's insulted everyone. She has set a bad example in not showing honor to her husband." And they said, "Let her royal position be given to another who is better than she." Well, who would replace Vashti as queen? A search took place throughout the land for the most beautiful young women that they could find, and they were brought to the palace under the supervision of Haggai, the king's servant. Working in the palace was a Jew called Mordecai. Mordecai had a cousin named Esther, also known as Hadassah, whom he had brought up because her parents had died. And so we have this special relationship between Mordecai and Esther. He raises her, she listens well to him, and they have a great relationship with one another. Esther was a beautiful young girl, and she was chosen to join the other contestants at the palace for 12 months of beauty treatments. This is Mary Kay for a long time. Mordecai advised her not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. Of the many women that were chosen, Esther was the one the king loved the most, and she was crowned as queen instead of Vashti. A feast was given in her honor, but she told no one that she was a Jew. A little while later, Mordecai was guarding the king's gate, and he overheard 2 servants, Bigthan and Teresh, plotting to kill the king. Mordecai immediately warned Esther of the plot, and she told the king. The 2 plotters were arrested. They were found guilty and hung on a tree. Their plot was recorded in the Chronicles of the King, where it was noted that Mordecai had uncovered the plot. Now, I want you to remember that was written in the King's Chronicles. After these things, the king promoted a man named Haman above all the other princes to be the 2nd most powerful man in the kingdom. All the servants working at the king's gate would bow to Haman when he entered. However, Mordecai would not bow down before Haman or show him reverence. "Why do you break the king's command and not bow down and honor Haman?" the servants asked. They knew Mordecai was a Jew. They kept asking him, but Mordecai just would not listen to them. They reported the matter to Haman, and he became very furious and wanted to find Mordecai, the Jew, who did not bow or revere him. Haman schemed to find a way to punish not only Mordecai, but also all of his people, the Jews. Haman went to the king and said, "There are people living in the land who have their own laws and obey them rather than the king's commands." He asked the king to write a law so that they could be destroyed. "I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's treasury to get this done." Well, the king took off his signet ring and gave it to Haman. "Keep the money, but do to these people what you think is best." The king's scribes were instructed to write a law that on the 13th day of the 12th month the Jews were to be attacked and killed and their possessions taken as plunder. The law was sealed with the king's ring. The law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed or altered. That's an important point. The new law was announced throughout the empire. When Mordecai heard of Haman's plan to kill the Jews, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went around the city wailing loudly and bitterly. Esther sent one of the eunuchs to find out what was troubling Mordecai. Mordecai gave him a copy of the new law. He asked him to tell Esther to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him to save her people, the Jews. Esther sent word to Mordecai saying, "Anyone who approaches the king's inner chamber without being summoned by the king is put to death, unless the king extends his golden scepter to them and spares their life. I have not been summoned by the king for 30 days. He sent her back this message: "Don't think that because you live in the palace, you alone of all the Jews will escape. If you remain silent, relief for the Jews will arise from another place, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Esther sent a reply to Mordecai: "Gather all the Jews in Susa to pray and fast for me. Don't eat for 3 days, and I will pray and fast with you. And then I will go to the king, even though he has not summoned me. And if I die, I die." On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. And when the king saw her, he was pleased, and he held out his golden scepter to spare her life. "What is your request?" he asked. "Even if you ask for up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you." "I'd like to invite the king," she said, "and Haman to a special banquet that I have prepared," Esther replied. So notice she wants to invite the king and Haman to a special banquet. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. "What is your request?" the king asked. "Well, I would like to invite the king and Haman to another banquet tomorrow, and then I will answer the king's question." Haman left the palace with a glad heart. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, still not bowing or trembling before him, he was full of rage. Haman went to his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth, his many sons, and all the ways in which the king had honored him. "I've been invited to a banquet by the king and queen tomorrow, but I cannot be happy as long as I see Mordecai the Jew is sitting at the king's gate." His wife and friends had an idea. Have a pole set up, and in the morning ask the king to let Mordecai be hanged on it. The suggestion delighted Haman, and he erected a pole that was 75 feet tall. He planned to go very early in the morning, the next morning, to speak to the king about hanging, or as most believe, impaling Mordecai, just sticking him on this pole. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the chronicles of his reign to be brought in and read to him. When the king read it, how Mordecai had exposed the plot to kill him, he asked, "What honor was given to Mordecai for doing this?" The attendants replied, "Nothing has been done." "Who is in the royal court?" the king asked. "Haman is standing in the court," they replied. He had come to ask for Mordecai to be executed, hanging on the pole that he had erected. "Bring Haman in," the king ordered. The king asked Haman, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wants to honor?" Well, thinking that the king wanted to honor him, of course, Haman replied, "Put the man in a royal robe that the king has worn and on a horse that the king has ridden. And then get the king's most noble prince to lead the horse throughout the city, proclaiming, 'This is what is to be done for the man whom the king delights to honor. Go at once and get the robe and the horse, the king commanded, and then do as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman had to robe Mordecai, put him on a horse, and lead him through the city, proclaiming, "This is what is done for the man the king honors." A humiliated Haman rushed home in grief and reported what had happened to his wife and friends. And they replied, "Since Mordecai the Jew has begun your downfall, you cannot stand against him. You will come to ruin." At that moment, the king's servant arrived to take Haman to the banquet. This is banquet number 2. To take Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared for him and the king. As they feasted, the king asked, "What is it you request? Even if it is half my kingdom, it will be granted. My request is that you save my life and the lives of my people," Esther replied. "We are to be destroyed." "Who has dared to threaten your life?" the king demanded to know. "An enemy," replied Esther, "this vile Haman." Haman was terrified. The king got up in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman started begging Esther to save his life. And when the king returned, he found Haman falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king said, "Will he assault the queen while I'm in the house?" Guards were called to seize Haman. And one of the eunuchs said, "Look, the gallows 75 feet high, which Haman made for Mordecai." The king said, "Hang him on it." Haman was led out to be executed. And then the king's fury subsided. That day the king gave Mordecai Haman's position. Esther told the king she was related to Mordecai, and the king gave Mordecai Haman's signet ring, and Esther appointed him to look over Haman's riches and possessions. Esther fell at the king's feet weeping and begging him to put a stop to the evil plan to kill the Jews. "If it pleases the king, let an order be written overruling Haman's plan." The king replied, "I have hanged Haman because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. Write another decree in my name and sealed with my signet ring. No document written in my name can be changed." The royal secretaries were summoned. A new law was written giving the Jews the right to gather and defend themselves if anyone attacked them. They could also plunder the properties of their enemies. Remember that. They could plunder their enemies if they so chose. When Mordecai left the palace, he was wearing a royal purple robe and crown. The Jews celebrated the news, and their enemies became afraid of them. The 13th day of the 12th month was the date the enemies of the Jews had hoped to destroy them, but the Jews gathered to defend themselves, helped by the governors and the nobles of the provinces. Any group who attacked them were struck down and killed. In the capital of Susa, Haman's 10 sons and another 500 men who hated the Jews were destroyed, but the Jews did not plunder their belongings. Permission was given to the Jews to continue dealing with their enemies the next day also. In the provinces, 75,000 of those who planned to destroy the Jews were annihilated. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews asking them to celebrate this victory every year on the 14th and 15th days of the 12th month. Haman had plotted and cast a lot, which is known as Pur, to destroy the Jews, so the celebration was called the Feast of Purim. It was a day of feasting and joy. People gave presents to each other, and the Jews have kept this custom every year through every generation to this very day. And so that's the story of Esther. And to me, it's one of the most riveting stories that you can ever read in all of the Bible, with all these fascinating turns of events. And so as we think tonight about the faith of Esther, the first thing that I want to stress about Esther is that Esther had faith in God's providence. I mean, isn't that the number one thing that jumps out in this book? I mean, how do you explain how Esther, a Jew, becomes queen of all of Persia? And how do we explain Haman ending up being impaled on his own gallows that he had built for someone else? And how do we explain the Jews being saved instead of being annihilated? The answer is God. God's providence. God was working in His wonderful providence to bring about all of these things. And let me tell you one of the things that's interesting about the book of Esther. Nowhere in the entire book of Esther is God ever alluded to. His name is nowhere in the book. And what's ironic about that is that here's a book that doesn't have His name anywhere in it, and yet there's not a book in the Bible that is more obvious that God was working in the things that were taking place. And I think that's a good point for us. Does God ever seem distant to you? Does God ever seem kind of silent to you? And it's in those moments when we're wanting so much to understand what's going on that we need the most faith of all. When God seems the most distant, that's when we need the greatest amount of faith. And Esther has that. She has faith in the providence of God and His workings in her life. So here's a point that we need to remember, that when we think God's not there, He's there. Always. He's always there. He's always attentive. He's always working. And that's when we need to trust. If you look at the word providence, you kind of have the idea, the P-R-O means before. The V-I-D-E is like our word video, which is the idea of seeing something. And so really when we talk about God's providence, we're talking about God seeing something before it ever happens. That God sees before. It's been compared to a traffic jam. You ever gotten on one of those on I-65 or somewhere, and you got a traffic jam, and you're kind of craning your neck to the side to kind of see if you can figure out what's going on up there, and you can't see any more than just maybe a handful of cars in front of you. But there's a helicopter flying up above, and that man can see everything. He knows exactly what's happening. He knows exactly what's going on. God's the man in the helicopter. God sees the end from the beginning. Now let me ask you a question. Who do you want working in your life? The God who can see the end from the beginning? The God who can see so much further than you can see? Or you in your limited vision? Certainly the answer to that is that we want God to be the one who is watching over things. And so Esther believed in the providence of God. And the diamond verse in this whole book, the verses that I preach about more than any other are those two right there. If I'm going to bring up Esther in a sermon, that's where she's going to be mentioned, is right there. You may remember this is where Mordecai is mourning, and she wants to know the reason. And finally he sends a message to her, and the message is simply this in Esther 4, verse 13 and 14. Do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And then this statement, yet who knows? I'm emphasizing who knows. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Do you understand what Mordecai is saying? He's saying, you know, Esther, when I look at everything and I consider that here you were kind of forgotten about, an orphaned young woman, a Jew at that, and you have come to be queen of all of Persia. When I look at that, I have to wonder if you've come to the kingdom for the purpose that's for right now. As our people are in danger of being destroyed, who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So they trust in God's providence. It, to me, is a lot like the story of Joseph. You remember in Genesis 45, all those terrible things that had happened to Joseph. And yet he finally, with weeping and crying, reveals himself to his brothers who had treated him so terribly. But he says in Genesis 45 and verse 5, he says, now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. And then in verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. Do you hear his belief in providence? He says, guys, I know you did it, and it was evil what you did, But God was working in all of that, and God was the one who sent me here through your actions. That's providence. And He has made me a father to Pharaoh and the Lord of all of his house, and ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. So we see that Esther believes in providence. Mordecai believes in providence. Joseph believes in providence. And then I like this one in the book of Philemon. That's that little bitty book right before the book of Hebrews. That little bitty book before the book of Hebrews. And you may remember this. Onesimus is a runaway slave. And he has run away from Philemon. So he has run away from Philemon, but when he runs away from Philemon, he runs into Paul. And he is taught the gospel by Paul. He is converted. He becomes a Christian. And Paul encourages him to go back and sends him back to Philemon. And as Paul looks at all that, he says, you know, it looks like to me that he may have run into me. He left you to run into me, so I can send him back to you, not only as your servant, but as your brother in Christ. Look at the wording in verse 15. For perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever. I want you to notice that in each of these examples, we have Mordecai saying, who knows? We have Paul saying, perhaps. Now, I think that's important. They believed in providence, but they did not always try to spell out what God was doing. So they're reading it, and they're saying, it just looks like to me that God is working in this, and perhaps this is what God is doing. So they all believed in providence, and I want to tell you, I believe in it too. In Romans the 8th chapter, in verse 28, Romans the 8th chapter and verse 28, speaking to us, listen carefully. In Romans 8 and verse 28, it says, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God. And that's key. Who is this? Who is this for? All things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to His purpose. Verse 29, for whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren. So that verse said that all things work together for good. Now, let me say something about that. That verse did not say that everything would be good. Somebody says, well, you know, a tornado came along and just blew our house down, and that wasn't good. And then there was this thing that happened in the economy, and I just lost so much in my 401k, and that wasn't good. Again, God didn't say it would all be good. God said the things that happen in our life are working for good. But here's something else I think people mention and fail to see. What is the good thing that God is wanting? Romans 8:28 says all things work together for good, but the next verse talks about being conformed to the image of His Son. That's what God wants for you. God wants you to be conformed to Jesus. And that means that I'm probably going to have some good things to happen in my life, and I'm probably going to have, like Jesus did, some bad things to happen in my life. But in all of that, God is working for good to make me like His Son through everything that happens. It all works for good. The illustration I love to use is, I love a chocolate cake. In fact, it's probably my daddy's favorite cake. A chocolate cake with them golden, buttery layers, you know. To me, it doesn't get any better than that. Don't worry about the homemade stuff. Just go buy, you know, Betty Crocker, that, just dip in that and slather it on there. That's good stuff. But you know, none of us reach into that box of Betty Crocker with all that flour, and that flour is awful. And none of us, at least not many people, some do, eat a raw egg. I'm not fond of that. But you know, you can take that flour and you can take those raw eggs and throw in a little sugar and mix it all up together, maybe even a pinch of salt. And that's some more good. Those ingredients by themselves were not good. But when they're mixed together, it works for good. And I think that's somewhat of an illustration of what God is doing in our lives as well. I can only speak for myself. I know as I look back over my life, I can see so many times when I know that God was working. I don't have to prove it to anybody, but it's my right to believe it. As I see the things that I see, and I see what was accomplished through that, even in bad times. There's been times I've been brought to my knees, and yet it has worked for wonderful, wonderful good. And so the first thing then about Esther is that we see that she had faith in God's providence, and that's why she works like she does. Well, here's the next thing. Her faith moved her into action. I mean, who in the world can move the heart of a Persian king? Who can move the king's heart? Who can save a people under a death law that cannot be altered? You can't change a law of the Medes and the Persians. I'll tell you who can change a king's heart. God can. And when you look at Proverbs 21 and verse 1, beautiful little verse that talks about what God can do in the heart of a king. Proverbs 21 and verse 1 says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes." A king's heart is like water in the hand of the Lord. Turns it whichever way he wishes. Esther prepares to do what she can do. Indeed, she has come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Her people are in jeopardy, and she knows that she has got to act. But here's a major point that I want you to be sure to take home with you tonight. When you are dealing with providence, we must be willing to wait on God. Sometimes it happens that, there's this problem that comes in our lives and we panic. And because we panic, we do rash things that are not thought out. We sometimes make matters worse by the things that we do because we're panicking in the moment. I think about Abraham and Sarah. They just kind of gave up on God. They just kind of quit waiting. And Sarah said, "Why don't you take Hagar?" And that really worked out well, didn't it? That was a big mess, is all that was. So as we prepare to do our part in whatever needs to be done, we must always be willing to wait on God. There's a hymn that we sing called "Teach Me, Lord, to Wait." And I've often said that Christians need weight training. W-A-I-T. We need some weight training. Esther's faith is in God. She's ready to do her part, but look at what she does. Coming now to Esther chapter 4, verse 16 and 17. She says, "Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." And then Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded. Notice she said, "I want to fast for 3 days, and I want all of you to fast likewise." I think we need to emphasize that when we're waiting, and especially when there's fasting and praying, by the way, they would fast and give up the lesser thing to do the greater thing. Prayer normally always accompanied fasting, and no doubt prayer is a part of this as well. But there's a lot happening in this silent time. I can imagine lots of praying, seeking God's direction, determining what's going to maybe be the best course of action here. I mean, there's no doubt when you see what Esther does that she's calculated what she's going to do after these 3 days. And then also, I think, gathering courage. I saw a bumper sticker one time that said, "Fear is courage that has said its prayers," or "Courage is fear that has said its prayers." All people in war have fear, but they muster that courage. And no doubt that's what Esther does during this time when she's waiting for God. So remember always that silent time is valuable time. And one of the things about waiting on God is you'll find that a lot of times God will save what He's going to do for the moment that He thinks it's going to accomplish the most. In other words, I can do more tomorrow than I can do today. So sometimes God will save what He's going to do for the time that's going to have the greatest impact. So just don't ever, ever, ever give up on God. And so Esther's moment comes and she knows that she has to do her part. Some people believe so heavily about God doing everything that they don't think about their part. I know you've heard the joke that's commonly told about a person that was on a rooftop about to drown, and a guy in a rowboat comes by and says, get in. And he's, no, I've got faith. God's going to save me. And then a little bit later, a motorboat comes by and he says, get on in. Here's your chance. No, God's going to save me. And then at last there's a helicopter that goes by and they drop a ladder down to him and he still won't take it. And he says, I have faith. God's going to save me. And the water continues to rise and he drowns. And thereafter he meets God and he's all upset and wants to know why in the world God didn't save him. He said, I sent you a paddle boat, a motorboat, and a helicopter. What else more did you want? We have to do our part as well. What a wonderful moment when she does her part. Turn to Esther 5 now, verse 1. It happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. And so it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It will be given to you up to half the kingdom. I love that moment. Can you imagine Esther with great dignity and poise making her way into the presence of the king, and there she stands. If I perish, I perish. And yet he holds out the scepter to her, and she walks up, touches the scepter, making connection with the king. And he says, what do you want? I'll give it to you up to half the kingdom. Wow. But here's something I want you to know. This is one of the points that enthused me when I studied. Esther knows the power of even one day. She has a first banquet, but she doesn't request what she wants at the first banquet. She has a second banquet, and it's at the second banquet that she's going to request what she wants. But what I want you to understand is that what happens between the first banquet and the second banquet is crucial. In one 24-hour period of time, there is so much that happens that sets this thing up in a most wonderful kind of way. So here's what I want you to know. Folks, one day makes a difference. I think about Joseph who was in prison for up to 2 years. What if he had given up one day before deliverance came? Sometimes all we need is one more day. And that's exactly what you see in this case. Because what happens is, as he leaves that first banquet, he's all puffed up with pride and arrogance. And then God puts one man in the right place. Look at chapter 5 now, beginning in verse 9. It says, so Haman went out that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called his friends and his wife Zeresh. He told them of his great riches and the multitude of his children and all the ways in which the king had promoted him and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet, that she is prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. And then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high. In the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and so he had the gallows made. You see one thing about uncontrolled anger. You ever notice how when people get really angry, I mean, they can really do some overboard stuff, like killing a cockroach with a sledgehammer. You just blow stuff everywhere, you know. 75 feet high? That's what you really call hanging them high. And that's what uncontrolled anger does. And here's the thing. He can hardly wait for daylight to come to show up early in the king's presence. And so the next morning, that's exactly what he does. But guess what happens the night before? The king can't sleep. One more night and he can't sleep. And so during this interval, this one day that Esther has between the first banquet and the second banquet, a lot of things are happening. And because he can't sleep, he wants the king to, he says, well, read to me the records of the king. That's boring stuff, you know. It's like somebody saying, you know, preacher, can you just preach to me a little while? You know, like a lady calls you late one night. Can you just preach to me a while? Why? She said, because I can't sleep. The king's records are really boring. But he has it read to him, and he has it read, just happens to read that part about Mordecai telling about these two that wanted to kill the king. He says, well, what did we ever do for him? And they said, well, nothing was ever done for him. And just that moment, he hears somebody in the court. Who's in the court? And they said, Haman's in the court. What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And you know this prideful dude, he's thinking, that's me. That's me. He's got to be talking about me. And he talks about all these wonderful things that can be done. Get a robe and a horse that the king has ridden on. Parade the man through the city. And the king says, great idea. Do it for Mordecai. And I can just imagine the expression on his face dropping. For Mordecai, the man that I hate. I've often thought, you know, when he first walks in, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? He's thinking, oh boy, I'm finally going to get what I deserve. Yeah, he is. And it comes his way. He lines it all up in a lavish way, and then he has to go out and do it for Mordecai. Somebody once said, when God is calling the shots, nobody can stop the action. I mean, the ball is rolling here, and there's no way for Haman to stop it. He can't stop it. I mean, it's in order. It's in command. He can't stop it. When God is calling the shots, you can't stop the action. And that's what you have. Well, our time is quickly getting away. We come now to our final point. And I hope you'll understand this last point. I told Susan on the way over, I don't know how well this one resonates, but I think it's important, and I may try to do it briefly for the sake of time. But her faith left vengeance in God's hands. I'll be honest with you, and I hate to say it, I think one of the reasons a lot of us like the book of Esther is because we're like, yeah, he got it. And maybe that's because we sometimes have people in our lives that we want them to get it. Sometimes, even though we might not like to admit it, we would like a little vengeance. And I think that's one of the things we see in the story of Esther. But here's one thing I want to point out. She wants salvation and justice for her people. But it does seem that she's restrained in some ways in regard to that. At that banquet, she revealed that Haman was the man. He comes into that second banquet. She reveals that he's the one who has planned all of this. He's the one who is trying to kill her people. The king rises in his wrath. He goes outside to the garden for a moment, and then he comes back in, and there Haman is laying across the couch there, begging for his life, and he thinks he's assaulting the queen. But I just want to say that I just simply see in Esther just some simple justice on her part. She seems to act as the judicial. I keep getting the wrong button. She seems to act as the judicial system. And even though it seems that vengeance was allowed, they showed some restraint. Let me show you one quick verse. In chapter 9, notice in verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. And he had said the king they could plunder all their enemies. But what they do is they don't really go out just trying to kill people. When you read the text, it seems like more they're acting in self-defense. It's only the ones who come after them that they kill. They're allowed to act in self-defense. The king had written that second decree that says you can defend yourself. And so they act in self-defense. But we also see, even after all Haman had done, they did not plunder his possessions. You would have think they were just sort of mopped up. I mean, we're going to give you all you got coming to you and then some. And yet, we see some measure of restraint. Esther just had a heart for her people. How can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? And she pleads for a revoking of the death decree. Again, she's acting as the judicial system. When I was studying, I found this, and I'll share it with you quickly. This indicates that when the Second World War ended, General Douglas MacArthur requested that President Truman allow him to stay in the land of Japan so that he could help bring back the dignity of the Japanese people as he assisted them in putting their country back on its feet after our atomic bombs had leveled the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Something in the heart of Douglas MacArthur prompted him to step back into that place of devastation and help those who had been our enemies. While many in America would have entertained thoughts of revenge, MacArthur was different. They need a government that works. They need their dignity. They need hope. They need strength to go on and rebuild. His enemies. But yet he wants to stay behind and see if he can't help them put some pieces back together. That's pretty tall, isn't it? And I see that this is what I see in the story of these Jews. Haman's 10 sons are hung, and it seems to send the message that what these men did and what their father stood for will never be allowed again. It takes a lot of faith to not seek personal vengeance, but instead leave things to God. You know Romans 12. To not return evil for evil. As much as depends on you, have peace with all men. If your enemy hungers, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap coals of fire upon his head. Vengeance belongs to me, God says. And it takes a lot of faith to not seek personal vengeance, but instead just leave it all to God. And I believe that's what I see in Esther. So as we finish up, we think of Esther hearing joy in the streets when she finally pillows her head. As she lay down on that first night of rejoicing, she could thank God for bringing walls down that nobody else could bring down. She could thank God for opening doors that nobody else could open, for preserving lives that nobody else could have preserved. And they celebrate this great feast called the Feast of Purim. Pur is the idea of casting lots. Haman had cast lots to determine the day in which they would all be killed, and that had all turned around. And so they call the Feast of Purim, which they still celebrate to this day. When you mix the power of God with the power of a godly woman, you have a winning combination. And that's certainly what you see in this woman. Well, thank you. I'm glad I finished by the top of the hour by about 30 seconds. I wondered about it when I saw how much I had. I had 80-something slides. Man. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I hope we learn these good things from the life of Esther. If you're here and you need to respond to the gospel of Christ tonight, we're going to sing a song to encourage you in your obedience. And if you need to come, please come now while we stand and as we sing.